Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Fabula Obscura podcast. I'm one of your co hosts, Ernest, and this is my other co host.
Mike, good to meet you.
Good to meet you. That
Good to
sounds
meet
like
you.
some Southern greeting
That's
words.
some customer service for the last 20 years type of, hey, how are you?
This is obviously episode one, if you want to call it the inaugural episode of this podcast. Mike and I have been talking about kicking a podcast off like this for a while, but it's taken us a while because we're both incredibly busy individuals. So, with that, I just wanted to give a little bit of a background for both of us. What drew us to this kind of stuff? You want to call it the paranormal or the odd, the obscure, and then why we decided to do this podcast and then go from there. So, Mike, if you want to start, tell us, how did you get to this point and why do a podcast like this?
You're keeping this absolutely completely open and vague. Supernatural in general, I think, has always been a thing that I gravitated toward since I was a kid. My mom she always had books around the house that had to do with witches or some sort of supernatural ghost haunted house related mystery thing. And then Scooby Doo, I think that was also a big thing. Just the idea of there's always that ghost that's in the haunted house that needs to be found, and then when you find it, it just happens to have a mask you pull off, and oh, it's Mr. Henson, stuff like that.
Mr. Henson.
Mr.
Wow.
Henson
Okay.
or with it's Mr. Jenkins, and they always say like, uh, I would have done it too if it wasn't for you, these meddling kids and their dumb dog, and he's Scooby Doo. Yeah, that's how 80s goes. Anyway,
The 80s. That was a long time ago.
it's funny. Scooby Doo actually started, I believe, in the 60s, if I'm not mistaken, and it went all the way from the 60s till through to the like early 2000s. It's crazy.
Yeah. No idea when it started, but I do remember seeing it as a kid too. And the, what do you call it? The hot box van they drove around.
Mystery
Yeah.
Mike,
Because
yeah.
that is a very 60s thing, right?
Yes.
So it makes sense that's where it came from, or at least that's where they got the idea from. But every time I saw that thing, obviously as a kid, I didn't think about it, but as an adult now, I'm like, man, that was a hot box
That's a hot
wagon. And they
box.
were
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
put it in front of kids. And we, of course, the kids had no idea. Like we had no idea back then.
When the van drives up to the house, you see the smoke behind it. It's not the dirt. It's really just the gun.
That could very well be it. And a van with no windows in the back, you know what that is, right? It's got
By
its own
by
unique.
definition,
Let's just put it that way.
fishy flipper.
So for me, I think what initially drew this to me was when I was in, I want to say middle school, somewhere around there, but probably before junior high, but maybe a little bit after elementary. I don't remember exactly. I think two of those are the same, but not when I was a little kid, but I'm going to guess around fifth, sixth grade, somewhere around there. The school I went to, so mind you, it was a Catholic school and there were nuns and all that kind of stuff. And anyone who's been
Ooh.
through that knows what kind of torture that is. But aside from that, the kids were like, I guess, also into the paranormal and specifically like local paranormal stuff. And I say that because everybody has their own paranormal thing, whether it's regional, cultural, whatever it is. And so in my case, it was like these kind of things we talked about as kids in this like little podunk Catholic school. And this place was like, thinking back on it, it was pretty run down. It was pretty rough. Kids got disciplined, let's just put it that way. And
You had the true horror. You didn't have the movie horror. You had the made up fake horror. You had the scary nuns. You had the wooden rulers. You had them
yep.
like that would have terrified me. That wouldn't give me
I mean,
nightmares.
we got hit a couple of times. I wouldn't go so far as to say abuse, although nowadays
A little bit.
you fart in someone's general direction, you abused them, right?
Hey,
But
that is
but
abuse to my nose, sir.
we got, what did they call it? Corporal punishment or
Yeah.
whatever it was. And it was, you behaved. Let's just put it that way. But anyway, this is where a lot of the stories came from. So we had some that were, and we'll talk a little bit more about them later, but the donkey lady, La Llorona, lechuzas.
Gee.
And then as I got a little bit older, it turned into stuff like the haunted train tracks that are over on the south side.
No,
Kind
no.
of went over to
For the people
that.
that don't know, also, Ernest and I are both from South Texas, San Antonio specifically. When we refer to these stories, these are usually historical, cultural stories that are localized to South Texas or in that general area. Or
Yeah,
hey,
Texas area.
would
Yeah.
you say that some of those stories would even transcend to different Hispanic cultures, different locations. You yourself are in California right now. Do you see stories in California? Do you hear stories in California that mimic the same theme or same style as Ya La Llorona or the
Not those kind of stories. I think there don't get me wrong, there are some absolutely terrifying horror stories around here. It's called state income tax. As far as, like, Llorona and all that I have not seen it here. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that when I say these things are cultural and they're also regional. So, for example, our version of La Llorona, which is very different than, say, one that comes from, like, Oaxaca in Mexico. That's a different story.
exactly.
Sometimes people will hear them and they'll hear both different stories and they'll either put them together and think they're the same thing, and they are two completely different stories that have nothing to do with each other. One of them is a sad, also horror story. The other one is a love story, right? They're completely different. They have nothing to do with each other. But again, regional, right? That's one thing. And by the time I got to California, I was already an adult, way into adulthood. The kids around here might be talking about stuff like that, but I haven't heard it, and I haven't heard it from either kids or adults. And then also we have the whole thing with the very local, like not even regional, but local to San Antonio stuff, right? Like again, the haunted train tracks, and
Mm,
these are things that
yeah,
I'm not saying that no other place in the world has their own version of haunted train tracks, but the
yeah.
ones we're talking about are very specific to that area right there on the south.
What's funny about the haunted train tracks in particular, I've seen videos of other similar sociographic. It's the way the ground is situated in that area in relation to the ground around it, which causes this type of anomaly. Which I mean, okay, so let's rewind. Explain what happens at the train tracks and how does this correlate to ghosts and supernatural?
Yeah, so the story, and again, this is another thing, like, you hear the story from different people, the story's a little bit
It's
different,
always
right?
different.
The core of the story is that there was a school bus full of children that broke down on the train tracks,
Mhm.
okay? And then rather than the bus driver quickly evacuating the kids, they attempted to get the bus going. A train was coming, there wasn't enough time, the train hits the bus,
Uh,
a bunch of kids die, and then there's a bunch of other stories around streets being named after the kids. Now, mind you, this is all,
thus
you
the
know,
urban legend is
yeah, this is an
born.
urban legend, folklore kind
Uh,
of thing of it. Now, fast forward to modern times when we were younger. Supposedly, what happens is you go and you park your car at one side of the train tracks, and not park it, but like you stop the car, put it in neutral, leave it alone, and then supposedly the children will push your car over the train tracks, right, trying to save you from the fate that they obviously succumb to. And then people will do different things, like they'll put baby powder on their back bumper, and
First time I
you
saw
know,
the baby powder thing, I saw actual like what I thought were fingerprints. I have to admit, it did scare me. I was like, "Whoa, that's a little weird."
yeah, I was telling you the other day, next time I'm down there, I should take the car I'm in, have my kids put their hands on the back bumper just to put the handprints and then throw the baby powder and blow it off, and you'll see the handprints.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
how
yeah.
that happens.
Yeah, of course.
But yeah, so that is the regional story. Now, again, folklore, urban legend, whatever. But I don't think there was a person in San Antonio who did not try to go down there at some point and replicate this little experiment.
Oh my god.
Um,
It's actually become a tradition to do this now in Halloween time. So Halloween, anytime toward like middle to end of October, even beginning coming into November, you will see people just in lines of cars driving up to the track, just waiting their turn to go over and to have their car pushed over the rail tracks, the railroad tracks.
We just set up a brand new website, fabulaobscura.com. We haven't done anything to it yet, but we'll put a link in the show notes as well as an article on the website that talks about the haunted train tracks, and see if we can crowdsource some photos for that to throw in there.
That'd
But
be
yeah, and that's exactly what it is. It's very regional, right? Some people have different kinds of experiences down there. Again, there's the urban legend aspect to it, but did it happen? We cannot find evidence that it happened at all.
really?
And
There's no
obviously,
I again, to your point of hearing different stories, I've actually heard that there was a an actual bus. It was like in the 50s, and now whether or not all no, because all the streets are still named after the kids. Something actually happened at
that's the urban legend part of it. When you go back and look, like, through the newspaper, back then you'd have to go look
archives.
at microfiche stuff, but
Yeah.
the point is you go back and look, you actually can't find any evidence. And yes, some of those streets happen to be named after people, but nobody knows whether that's a kid or an adult. And I think that's one of the things where the urban legend has evolved over the years, right? They try to incorporate some new stuff into it to make it seem more real or whatever the case is. But again, it very well may have happened. But as far as like looking at uh, resources or references for it, I couldn't find any. But it's like anything else we talk about and we're going to talk about in the rest of this podcast, where everyone has their experiences, they have what they've seen, what they know, but it's very hard to put the word proof on it. That's the hard part, right?
Yeah, and I think experiences are the key. Everything is relative to the person, right? Everything is relative to the person's personal experience, which leads me to remind. Have you ever heard of a movie called Ghost Watch?
No.
Okay, so it's a movie, but it's also a documentary. So essentially, what happens is the general premise is this was like 1992 BBC. Okay, so going to be a live broadcasting of a ghost investigation of a haunted house in Great Britain. This was 1990s Britain. So you have to understand at this point in time, society as a whole, and they weren't really into ghosts. They weren't into, I mean, they were, it was always viewed as like this fringe thing, this thing that, you don't really want to look at, you don't want to focus on because it's going to affect you. It's going to make you evil. It's going to make, demonic or something, or
So it sounds a lot like the satanic panic that happened here in the United
exactly.
States as a result of the Dungeons and Dragons craze back in the 70s and 80s.
Exactly, exactly. And then couple that with, and this respectfully to the Brits, anybody watching, they're rather, reserved and conservative in the way they do things. So adding that to this supernatural, no, that doesn't exist. That's not real. Okay, so fast forward, they do this show where it's this little home. There's a single mom. She has two daughters. They're experiencing voices they hear. They have their beds are moving in the middle of the night. They can't sleep. They have smells and weird things happening in their homes. The news crew come, they're making light of this whole thing. They think it's just a silly situation. There's okay, we're just going to videotape throughout the house and have interviews with people outside and just make a little night of it. And mind you, it's broadcasting live to the studio. And in the studio, there's um she's like a psychologist, psychiatrist person that's taking notes because she's worried about the kids and their mental state and things like that. And of course, there's a host of the show, and the host of the show is just his standpoint, of course, is, "Hey, I'm just a conservative British guy, and I don't believe any of this stuff, and I'm just here to watch the show." As the show progresses, things start happening in the house that correspond to the studio, and you all of a sudden the connection between the two, and then enter this true ghost story that might have actually happened within this world. Long story short, this was a show that was broadcasted live in BBC. The ramifications after the fact, the people were traumatized. People were they sent letters, people called the station, people were they said they couldn't sleep for months. They this one show was so blacklisted that not until I'd say maybe about 4 or 5 years ago, it wasn't even available anywhere to be seen. In fact, the only copy I ever had was a bootleg AVI that I downloaded off of a torrent years ago, and I just have had this one copy of it, and I have it, but now it's available on Amazon, by the way. There's a whole other story. But somebody actually ended up committing suicide after the watching of the show because they were that affected by what they saw. But it's a testament to believing which how vulnerable
Yeah.
are people's personas and what their perception of reality, things like that.
Yeah, and there's an entire I don't know what you wanna call it. I guess you could call it a belief maybe, but there's an entire thing about voodoo and some of these darker religious type things where there's a belief that it cannot affect you if you don't believe in it, but once you believe it, it can affect you. And
Right.
that's into other areas of, for example, another kind of belief with the paranormal things where a lot of people like you obviously have heard of like people being born sensitive to that kind of stuff. They can see it, it can see them or whatever the case is. then you also hear about this the other thing where, like, people are oblivious to this, right? And because they're oblivious to this kind of paranormal stuff, the things on the other side can't see them either. But then at some point, for whatever reason, that person experiences something or now believes, and all of a sudden they're visible
It's almost like it
other side.
unlocks some door, it opens some portal in their mind that allows them to
Yeah.
be able to perceive this other world, whatever.
And it all makes sense when you, like, put it together, right? Because if this stuff does exist, and if in fact the brain is like a conduit between these different, like, realms or whatever, it would make sense that you'd have to open the door in the mind to be able to see between these things. Anyway, yeah, it all ties together. It reminds me a lot of, again, the satanic panic that happened in the, at least for me, it was mostly in the 80s, right? Everyone was afraid of Dungeons and Dragons. And turns out, fast forward to now, it's a joke that people were that scared of stuff back then, but also not. Like, people don't understand things. This happens all the time. So yeah, no, I haven't seen that, and it's interesting. And it reminded, while you were talking about it, it reminded me, we were talking about the regional aspect of this. So we in the United States did not hear about that or experience it. Like, you happen to randomly get this bootleg AVI, and
Yeah.
like you said, it's now on Amazon. We'll include a link to it in the show notes as well for our viewers and listeners to go find it if they want to.
Yeah.
And that reminded me of the, and again, I can't remember the name of the story, but it's the one about the computer that the person was able to communicate with somebody either in the past or in the future. I can't remember, it was through, like, this
Yeah.
old computer that had no kind of internet connection, right? This thing was literally just a standalone, think about a computer from the 80s, like an Apple IIe or something. But maybe it was it was like a Commodore maybe, or what was the other one that was popular in the UK? I can't remember. There was like the Commodore, there was a
I don't remember.
Z Z80 or Z something or other. Anyway, Simon, or I wish I could remember all the computers, like, that were made outside the United States, but anyway, it was
I'm
one of
gonna say,
those.
like,
And
why would you know any of them?
yeah, because it turns out that some of these are very popular in the, if you wanna call it, the retro
Oh,
gaming
you're retro
community,
gaming, yeah.
because there were games that were made, there were a lot of games that were made in Europe that were actually very good, and a lot of Americans don't realize that. For example, one of the very common ones is Tetris. A lot of people have played Tetris many times, and they've heard the music, and they think that, "Oh, it's just like some kind of funny," uh, but they don't realize it was actually made in Russia by Russians. Of course, back then it was the Soviet Union, but you get the point. There are these retro things that we hear about later in the United States, and we're like, "Oh, that was actually pretty cool." This was one of them, this story, and apparently there's a book that was written about it, and that book, I don't know about now because I haven't looked at this in the last probably decade, but there was a period of time where just the book about that was out of print and so difficult to get your hands on. People were paying hundreds or thousands of dollars for a paperback copy of this, like, book.
Mhm.
So, I don't remember, dude. I wish I could remember what it was called, and I'll
Okay.
try to go find it and put it in the show notes if I can remember and if I can find it, but if not, forgive me. But people watching this probably know what I'm talking about. They're gonna, and if you do,
Mm.
put it in the comments, please, so that others can find it, because it was a very interesting story. And again, I heard it like maybe a decade ago, and then it just so happened like a couple of years ago, probably around 2020, maybe 2021, somewhere around there. I was watching YouTube, and I don't wanna call it a documentary, but it was like a documentary, came up on my feed, and I watched it, and I was like, "Whoa, that's awesome." And I had, again, had never heard of it prior to hearing about it a decade ago, but when the thing was, when I heard about it a decade ago, it was in passing, it was very quick, and I didn't get, like, a lot of detail about it. I was just like, "Oh, that's cool, whatever." But when I watched this, like, documentary or whatever you wanna call it, I was like, "Wow, there's actually a lot more to this story than I thought about."
I wish I knew more about it.
I wish I had known more about it too, but anyway, if you know what we're talking about, put it in the comments so your fellow listeners and viewers
The
can
Thing,
get an
that was
idea
about
about
the
that.
movie, that was about The Thing, that was about the documentary about The Thing, and it was with The Thing with the people. Remember that
Yeah,
one?
somebody's gonna know exactly what I'm talking about, because 'cause they're gonna be like, 'cause they, one thing I've noticed is when you get into these little fandoms, and, like, the paranormal is a fandom in and of its own, everyone has these things that they are really into. There's gonna be at least one person who watches this who's really into that story, and or they're a viewer from the UK who knows exactly what we're talking about. They're gonna be like, "Oh, yeah, here it is. Boom, here's all the information about it." And that's what's great about YouTube and this stuff in general. It's like you can crowdsource a lot of this stuff, right? Whereas back in the day, the only way to know about this was either you lived in that region and got the information, or you somehow heard it by word of mouth from somebody from that area. All
Oh,
right, let's move on. So, yeah, just rolling forward, one of the things I wanted to point out is that Mike and I are just two normal guys. We've known each other for quite a while. I think back in 2001 was when we first met in college. I'm not sure
One
about
or
the
two,
actual
something like
year,
sounds right.
something like that, but let's just say over 20 years. And yes, Mike is old. So
Yeah,
keep
yeah.
that in mind.
Shoot.
So when we're talking about our experiences, they're going to be formed by stuff that happened, say, 80s through probably like early 2000s. And then, of course, after that, we move into like adulthood and go through the
We
journey
lived
everyone
during
else
the
does.
time of payphones and before cell phones existed.
Before cell phones existed and also before the internet existed,
Oh,
at
yeah.
least the internet as you know it today, right?
Oh my
Even
god.
even if you go as far back as to say dial-up counted as yeah, that's true. We predate that, just so you know. So all the dumb stuff we did when we were younger, there is no video of it. There's no evidence of it, unlike anybody who's young now or
Very true, and that
so
stuff is being
be
documented
careful.
everywhere.
Yeah, be careful. So, one of the things that I wanted to discuss here was to break stuff up into little groupings, if you want to call it that. And there's like, when you talk about ghosts or the paranormal or just paranormal activity or not the movie, paranormal activity as in the entity or the thing itself.
Although the first
Uh,
one was legit.
the first one was legit. No joke, man. I still remember going to watch that first one in the theater, and we'll talk about that story in a minute. But
Dude,
before we get into that, I wanted to talk about the differences, right? So when I was doing a little bit of research before this episode to prepare for it, I noticed that there were kind of three that it was primarily talking about, and my notes here say residual, intelligent, and poltergeist. Now, we come from a little bit further back than a lot of our listeners and viewers from, and Mike is old. So we did see the poltergeist as younger people. I don't wanna say kids, but well,
sir, don't be grouping me into that because I didn't see the Poltergeist until I was probably, like, in college.
I did see it younger than that.
Yeah, no.
I don't know exactly how old I was, but I was not yet in high school the first time I saw it. So I was definitely too young to be watching something like that. I don't remember how or why it happened, but I watched it.
Yeah.
And that makes sense, right? So I understand poltergeist activity, and if I had to give my own, like, layman's definition of it, because again, we're not experts in this stuff, we're just 2 normal guys. But if I had to give my definition of it, it's something where, like, your mind or your psyche is projecting something out that's manifesting itself as, like, a paranormal activity. Is that how you understand it too?
For Poltergeist? Yeah, that's
Yeah,
exactly right. So, essentially, like, some kind of a trauma, some kind of traumatic experience just culminates and it builds the energy up to a certain degree, but in a negative response, and that manifests into some kind of action or a thing that
got it.
makes things
So
happen.
so basically like eating Taco Bell.
Exactly. When you sit down, there's some demons coming up.
That's what I thought. Okay, so poltergeist, so that to me, that builds the mental mnemonic there. It's like poltergeist, Taco Bell. Got it. Okay. Now, what about residual and intelligence? Let me guess, and then you tell me if I'm right. So, residual to me would be like someone has passed away many years ago, and as the person are seeing something, like maybe a part of history, like repeating itself, like that entity is doing it over and over in a loop, and like they don't, have an idea you're there, and they're not interacting with you or with anything other than their like own little bubble. And it would seem like intelligent is one where that thing, whatever it is, knows that it's either out of place or whatever the case is. It may know that you're there. And so it's trying to interact with either you or the environment in a way to show that it still has some kind of intelligence and it's there and it wants you to acknowledge it. That to me is what those two are, but that's just a guess.
Yeah, you're right. Pretty much it.
Interesting.
We're done. Thanks for have a great day.
End of episode
It
bye. No,
is.
okay.
Bye. No, it's exactly
So
right. So your residuals are it's funny because when you said this, the prime example I thought of was the Institute of Texan Cultures. If you Google
mm,
this, there's a video of a ghost walking through the gift shop and going to the wall and like stopping and then proceeding through the wall as if he was reaching for a doorknob, opening the door, and then walking through a door. And then they've done research where they showed previous blueprints of the building where there was a door there like 100 years previously or whatever.
yeah,
And so that's residual. There's no direct connection to present time. It's just like you said, a loop of just a reoccurring action that's just stuck in time.
yeah. And they're tearing that place down now. I heard. I'm
Yeah.
obviously I don't live there anymore, but like my great uncle was a docent there for decades, and
Yeah,
I went to that place, I can't even tell you how many times
me
growing up
too.
there, and to hear that it's getting torn down is sad, but I also heard they're moving, like, all the exhibits somewhere else, so it's not like they're getting rid of it, they're just that building is going down.
Yeah, but
Uh,
I bet there's gonna be some kind of commercial hotel or some commercial
something, yeah, yeah.
make money.
It makes sense, right? But it is what it is. And then on the intelligent one, to me, that's like the prototypical, if you want to call that, ghost hunters and all the other clones of that, where they go to a place where there's a haunting and they're trying to like either provoke it or interact with it or
Have
thing
some
that's
sort
not.
of communication with
Yeah,
it where they're both aware that they're both there and they're both aware.
yeah.
Yeah.
Like we're watching you. It's so that the ghost knows that I'm watching them, and then I know that the ghost knows that I'm watching them, and the ghost knows that I know that they know that, and it's one of
Yes, man. Yeah, yeah.
exactly. Okay,
All
makes
that.
sense. That makes perfect
It's the Spider-Mans pointing at 3 different Spider-Man at each other. The
exactly.
multiverse of Spider-Man.
And that's one
Um,
of those areas that I will never do. I'm not saying that I wouldn't do like the whole ghost hunting thing and EMF detection, all that, but
no, you would.
provoking something, nah, not my cup of tea. That could because at the end of the day, I'm still human and I'm still alive. I can actually be hurt. That thing can't, right? That you're on the wrong, you're on the losing end of a provocation there when you start doing stuff like that. So I totally get it. And hey, if it's your thing, provoke
Power of
away, but
power of
not going to
Christ
be my thing.
compels you.
Yeah, Stigmata, excellent movie.
That was not what I was
Um,
saying, but okay.
yeah. Anyway, moving on. Okay. So those are the 3 loosely, and obviously there's a lot of movies that have been, and we'll get to a section a little bit later that talks about pop culture, but yeah, those are the loose areas, and I guess there are others too that I'm just not aware of, but I wanted to cover those 3 because I was looking at it for some research for the episode to see what exactly are these different types of things. And the other area I think that we're gonna delve into a little bit in this podcast in general is what I would consider also paranormal, but not in that same vein as stuff like extraterrestrial stuff, because
Okay.
that to me is also a little bit related in that it's not necessarily ghosts per se, but it's also
Sure, though, by
supernatural.
definition, yeah, for sure.
That's a good way to put it, supernatural, as opposed to but also paranormal because it's not normal.
Right, yeah.
It's abnormal if you wanna call it that. So we'll delve into that too. I'm a huge fan of the X-Files, and I think that's an area where I'll be able to contribute a lot more is because that's an area that I followed more than the ghost stuff is the and
So
more because I had an interest in technology and, specifically the whole concept of, like, alien technology versus what did we develop ourselves. So
okay,
that
so then let's do that. Let's talk about right now. Let's say, so what's your stance on that then? Because see, I am lately of the school that we are this is my own personal opinion. So you can tell me what you think about this, but I think that I've seen enough to understand that we are number one in a simulation. There is no there are no stars necessarily outside of our planet per se, much as it is just a representation of something that might or might not be there. Because technically, I've if this is a simulation, I personally am now the only person that's experiencing all of life from my perspective. So you
uh
are the NPC.
it's a possibility, right? So let me give a little sliver here to kind of preface where I'm gonna go with it. One thing for our viewers are to know is that I actually work in tech. I have 2 engineering degrees, undergraduate and master's, and I do this for a living. So I have a very deep understanding of technology and how it's evolved over the years. And I too have a suspicion. Now, I'm not going to go so far as to say like I have a belief or a cult or whatever you want to call it, but I've always been one that says I don't believe in coincidences.
Right?
I just don't. And so when something happens that it's wow, that was a coincidence. No, it wasn't. There's a reason for
There's a
that.
reason.
And as I get older and as I work with technology more, I definitely have a suspicion that not all of our technology has been developed entirely by us. I won't go so far as to say that we stole alien technology or that aliens directly helped us build technology, but I will say that there are certain things that if I look back at the historical pace of progress for technological development all the way up until let's say around the 60s to 70s and then you look at it after that, it just seems that it did a hockey stick very rapidly. Now, here's the thing that could absolutely be normal and could absolutely be explained by just normal things,
Mhm.
right? It could, but it's a little odd, right?
Normal
So,
progression of
and again,
technological
don't
advancements.
Yeah, and so I don't like I don't have a hard belief one way or the other, but I do have a suspicion that we've been aided, let's just put it that way, to accelerate things. The other thing is, like you said about the simulation thing. Now, again, my take is a little bit different because I look at it more from like the theoretical physics and mathematical side of it, but I have heard some
That
very
is from
convincing
that
arguments.
perspective.
I've heard some very convincing arguments from theoretical physicists and mathematicians that indicate that we are in fact in a simulation. The problem is, again, it's not a proof, right? It's more of a theory, and even that, it wouldn't even land the scientific definition of a theory as opposed to what we normally use as a word the word
But
theory
then
for.
you if you're gonna wait on the scientific, like, the scientists that actually make the decisions and make say, "This is what is fact, this is what is not fact." A lot of those people are also being funded by corporations that could possibly be leaning their opinions in certain directions.
Of course, human nature, and that's capitalism. But when
Exactly.
I look at it detached from that, from was this published in a peer-reviewed context, right? So are there peers
Yeah.
globally who are not on the payroll of such corporations and whatever, looking at these mathematical proofs, trying to prove them out themselves, and then coming back and say, yes, in fact, this is correct, or no, we don't think this is correct, right? So like the site, you're right that like individual scientists and individual research can very much be influenced by all kinds of things. Just look at Theranos and that
Oh,
massive scandal.
shoot, yeah.
Great example of what you're saying. But when you start talking about global peer
She
review,
had the
like
best
it's
voice, by the way.
possible, but it's very hard. But I also, again, I've heard some very convincing mathematical proofs lately that kind of indicate that we are in one. And again, it's not too hard to believe it. Now, you got to also remember that we're human beings and we're bound by our own experiences and our own knowledge. So when I look at it, I say, okay, I personally am not a mathematician. I personally am not a theoretical physicist. So
Yes, you are.
I
So am
can't give
I.
definitive proof one way or the other on that. But what I can say is I know enough about math and engineering that when one of these individuals comes and says, here's what I think and here's why, I can look at it and say, yeah, that kind of makes sense. Obviously, I want to see the proof, the scientific proof of it, but I can see where the theory that you're proposing is a valid one and could actually be true. So I agree with you that we probably are in one. That the hard part is, again, looking at it from like a technologist viewpoint, the amount of computing power you would need to generate that simulation would be what we call planetary scale computing,
Exactly.
right?
Yep.
And
That's
so you would need a technology that is so far advanced to
mhm.
what we can even think of today,
Now,
which
let me
is
pause you.
completely
Let me, if
possible.
I may, let me pause you right there. Now, you're talking a planetary scale of power. Now, what does that sound like to a standard, normal, earthling human being? If somebody tells that to somebody, it sounds like a being that can create a planet or create energy, enough energy to run a planet. It sounds like a god. And now, in terms of gods, that is simply a title or a name given to a being that is simply beyond our understanding. So I'm not taking it on a religious trip here, but at the same time,
You
I am, but I'm not because it's not so much as God in a religious sense as much as it
but it
is a fifth dimensional or a sixth dimensional being that is simply creating life and saying, "Here, let me just and see what happens,"
yeah,
type of
it almost doesn't matter because if we are in a simulation, all of that is simulated.
exactly.
Right? So that's what happens, right? So and this is where a lot of these theoretical physicists and mathematicians are coming from, is where as humans try to prove stuff in one direction, like going towards the outcome. And a lot of times, if you go the other way around and you start at the outcome and work backwards, you end up with some very interesting things, right? So if you started from the position of we are in a simulation and that is fact, okay? So
Right,
you start from there
right.
and then you start looking at everything else, it's wow, okay, now a lot of this stuff makes more sense,
Yes.
right?
I mean,
And so this
you
is
look at the way, like, nature essentially builds, like, on a molecular level, like beehives having geometrical shapes and Fibonacci's seed numbers being seen in shells, the creation of shells, seashells, and things like that, just this repeated patterns
yeah, so
just
there
throughout our nature.
Exactly, and so there's a scene from The Matrix that I always think about, the original Matrix movie, mind you. The other ones were okay, but, like, the original one where, or maybe it wasn't the original one, it might have been in a different. I feel like it was the original one, what but
Was
because
it?
it's the scene where, they're sending all of the squiddies down,
Yeah.
and they're gonna bust into Zion, and Morpheus says something like, there's one machine for every man, woman, and child. It sounds exactly like the thinking of a machine to me." And so
Yes.
that is where you start coming up with, like, why on earth would a beehive, for example, have a perfect hexagonal shape and a bunch of them at that? And then every now and then you'll see like imperfections in the design or whatever. Like, why is that the case? And again, when you're talking about looking at something from a mathematical perspective, you're like, that sounds like something a machine would have come up with versus a human being. And
Yeah.
it gets into the kind of this super gray area. But we're definitely going to explore these kind of ideas a lot deeper as we go into further podcast episodes. And I'm hoping I
Yeah.
can bring a little bit of like math and engineering, to a tiny bit of computer science into the discussion
And I would bring a
because I
little crazy into the discussion.
so yeah, we'll talk about all that kind of stuff in
Shoot.
future episodes and we'll give a little bit more perspective in that and it should be pretty interesting. So I wanted to circle back. We talked about our childhood earlier and talked a little bit about how it impacted us and we gave some of the examples. We talked about the train tracks, but I wanted to delve a little bit more into a few others. So I wanted to start with you. Aside from the train tracks, right? What were some other either ghost related or paranormal type things that you heard of as a kid growing up in San Antonio that kind of influenced your love of the paranormal and got you to where you are today?
You had actually mentioned it earlier, the donkey lady. Where my elementary school, the back end of it was, there was just like an open little playground area. The back fence was butted up against a nunnery. And so we'd be out there in the middle of the afternoon playing and doing our thing. We just literally walked out of the rooms, walked by and walked into a room. But just the fact that we saw somebody that looked fully in full nun uh, garb with habit and everything to a 6-year-old hearing about donkey ladies that apparently can fly and are nuns and they have a donkey's face to the nuns. It was terrifying. And so one time it was a shed taking out a bag of trash. It was just a black trash bag. And 2 or 3 kids started screaming. Because now that at this point in time, this was just like a reoccurring thing. Every time we'd come out to go play at our recess, we see the nuns there. Oh, it's obviously the donkey lady because that's where she lives. And then then it just so happens that this one day she comes out with a black trash bag, and this kid starts screaming out, "Oh my god, she's got dead bodies in there!" I, yeah, people are just screaming, and that was just the funniest, obviously.
She might have had dead bodies in there
She
for all you
probably
know,
did.
but
I don't know what donkey ladies did with dead body parts. That was definitely a thing that freaked me out a little bit.
yeah, so one of the and that yeah, the donkey lady was one I remember hearing about a lot. Bloody Mary. I don't know if you don't heard about that one,
I
but
did hear about it. I never did it. That was the one that where you'd go to the bathroom, you stare into the mirror, look into the mirror, turn the light off, say Bloody Mary 3 times in the mirror, and are you supposed to turn around or something like that? I think also.
I don't it's so long ago, I don't remember, but I remember
Yeah.
that part. It's you look into the mirror, you say it 3 times, you turn the lights on and off, and something or other was supposed to happen.
The
And so
chick's supposed to come out. That's it. She's supposed to come out of the
yeah,
mirror
something like that,
and
right?
scratch
And
you, and then you turn the light on. If you had a scratch
yeah.
on your hand, then you got touched by Bloody Mary.
Yeah, so there was and I don't remember the scratch part, but I do remember the rest of it, and I remember being in a bathroom when somebody was doing it one time. I wasn't, like, the one doing it, but I was
Yeah,
there and I like, nothing happened and I walked away.
you should
But
not.
I remember that kind of being a thing. And then the one that I think stuck with me, there was probably 2 more that stuck with me. So La Llorona was an interesting one. Again, I don't know the whole thing, but it was something about a woman who drowned her kids and for whatever reason and was, like, perpetually crying, trying to find them, like her ghost or whatever.
She
And the
she
thing that
killed her kids and then killed herself.
something like that, right? And
I
she's like she's looking for them forever,
Yeah,
right? And she's
yeah.
crying. But the thing that like the reason that one stuck with me wasn't the story, it was the fact that over on the south side, there was a creek that was named Woman Hollering Creek.
Yes.
and supposedly, like, that's how that thing got its name, but
Okay.
again,
Do you know
like,
anybody that's
why else
actually
would you name
do you know anybody that's actually been there? Maybe driven out there at, I don't know, 11, 12 o'clock at night?
I don't say I know anybody who's done that, but
Oh,
it just seemed random that you would name a creek Woman Hollering Creek. That's a hell of a randomly specific name to give to a creek, you know?
also naming, streets after kids in an area where
That too.
something didn't happen.
That's true. So it's just weird. And then, yeah, so, like,
Dun,
growing
dun,
up,
dun.
that was one that I remember hearing about and thinking to myself, like, at first thinking, like, "Yeah, that doesn't make sense." But then when I saw that creek, I was like, that's either an epic troll by whoever named that creek, right? Like, whoever worked for the city or whatever that named it. It's either an epic troll or there's something more that we don't know about.
I'm telling you,
And
man,
then
there's probably a true story behind it, or a legend, if not, if anything.
well, what's crazy is that legend, like, I remember mind you, this was probably 20 years ago now that I went looking it up, and it turns out that legend actually came from Mexico, and there's an entire story
Oh,
around
of
it.
the woman dying and her trying to find her kids.
Yeah, again, I don't remember it exactly, but it had something to do with there was a woman, and obviously she had a couple of young kids, and she found out her husband was cheating on her
That's what it
and
was, that's what it was.
ended up murdering the
And then
kids
she
in
just went
spite.
to pray, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and then it all spiraled. Okay, so that came over, right? And then obviously it changed because it local traditions or whatever, and it is what it is. But then that's why I said, why would they name the creek that? So either somebody was a mega fan of that story, which sounds creepy in and of itself,
So
or it was an epic troll, which I want to believe that it was an
or
epic attack.
or it could just be maybe somebody that cared about that story, or maybe the lady, somebody that was related to the lady,
Yep.
and maybe
It
it,
could also just be that like there is some kind of natural like thing there where when the wind blew by, it sounded like that, right? Who knows, right?
so let's go ahead and name an entire creek for that.
Sounds great. Sounds
Sounds
like a plan to
sounds like a
me. Hey, if you're getting paid to name a creek, you might as well name it whatever you want, right? So there's that. Um,
cacahuate.
there you go. And then the last one I want to talk about regionally, and mind you, again, we will definitely do like individual episodes and delve deeper into these. But the other one is La Lechuza, right? And that's one that I had a personal experience with. And I won't go into it now because it's something that we should have a longer episode around. But that one is basically saying that witches, they're able to cast spells of different kinds, right? What I have heard is that lechusa is like when a witch puts a curse on you, the lechusa is what they send after you. And so the belief or whatever you want to call it there is that La Lechusa isn't just an owl, it's an owl that has the face of a human being on it, and it's sent after you as part of a curse. But again, these are the things that we were told as kids, and I actually have an experience with one of those. But I also think that part of that is part of it is what actually happened, and part of it is like what you think happened because you heard all these stories and then something happened and you put the things together and it turns into more than what it actually was, or it actually did happen and you're like, that's messed up. I don't want that to ever happen again. So there's that. So that's a lot of truth on that. And again, we'll delve into each of these in different episodes with more detail. But and that's just a starter because as you and I know, these kind of things are all over the world.
Mhm.
There's all kinds of these, and we hear about them all the time. And even today, I will find in modern times, I'll come across a new one that I've never heard about in some other part of the world. And it's wow, that's super cool. Sometimes they're like completely different than what we've heard. And sometimes they're very similar, but just in a different part of the world. And so when that happens, you start questioning why is their story similar to mine? And because they're very far away from us. And
Blood myths.
hey, do you remember a movie that Sinbad was in where he
Oh,
was the genie?
yeah.
And it turns out there was no movie like
No,
that.
yeah,
But
it's Mandela effect, man. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And that's one where it's wait a minute, that didn't actually exist, but somehow it's in the cultural like psyche that this thing exists, but it doesn't. And that in itself to me is like a big how does this happen type of thing.
We'll
Like,
see, and then that goes on with this, it goes into this whole other direction because number one, you could either be the shift in or a redirection of the timeline if you want to go that outside of the box, or is it a I've even seen some people say where this is the government or this CIA trying to essentially rewrite history by negating any specific things that may have happened in the past. And they use that as like a training thing, or essentially
Oh,
like
yeah,
or
absolutely.
a
I've heard
testing
that one.
scenario where it's like, let's just try to with this one movie that no one's ever heard of and then make it not exist. Then
Yeah, and by the way, this has happened throughout history, right? Like the Nazi regime fell, we got a hold of a lot of records from like some of their scientists who are experimenting on all kinds of things, eugenics, and we found out that they had their own, I don't want to call it mind control experiments, but just think of like mental manipulation experiments. Now, I don't know that any of them were ever successful, but they were working on it. When the Soviet Union collapsed, we got a hold of information that they were working on it. We know that our government has worked on it. So it's one of those things where it's not too much of a leap to say, maybe somebody succeeded along the way and figured something out, right? Now, obviously, we don't have proof, but it just goes back. And that's one of the things that's common to a lot of the stuff we're talking about on this podcast, which is some of these things are harder to prove, some of them are impossible to prove. But if you just look at the, I don't know what you want to call it, circumstantial evidence
common
around it, you're like,
sense.
the likelihood is higher that it is the case, then it's not the case. So
Yeah.
anyway, that's one of those things. So yeah, and that's another area that we'll delve into is talking about some of these areas where these governments were doing experiments and either the public found out about them and they weren't supposed to, or it was one of those things where supposedly the thing never panned out, never succeeded. They closed it down, but they really didn't close it down. And then we'll also even talk about it from the perspective of one of the greatest movies made of all time, Independence Day never
Oh,
existed.
and then
They attempted something and they failed at it, and then it turns out, yeah, it has existed for a while, and we even kept it secret
DARPA,
from yeah, DARPA's been around for a long time. Matter of fact,
really
DARPA is responsible for our viewers and listeners being able to watch this episode right now, and we'll talk about that in
thanks,
down the
Obama.
road. Thanks, DARPA. We love you. We appreciate you. So before we roll into the last section of at least this first episode, I wanted to let our listeners and viewers know that if you have any questions or you want to share comments, stories, thoughts, or whatever, please put them below. Right now, that's the primary way to interact with us, and we want to hear from you. As I mentioned earlier, we do have a website that we just literally set up this past week. And by the time this gets published, we'll have some stuff on there. But leave all of your comments and thoughts below. We're going to put obviously a couple of things in the links in the description for different things we've talked about today, as well as a copy of those same show notes and links on the main website for Fabula Obscura. And if you're into this kind of content and you enjoy it, please give this video a like, subscribe, but which you hear from every YouTuber. But I want you to do one more thing for us that not a lot of YouTubers ask for. Some of them do, but not a lot of them is share it with your friends, share it with your family. If there's someone else that might enjoy this kind of stuff, share it with them because word of mouth is way more powerful than a lot of people give it credit for.
Share it with your mailman. Your mailman likes it. Trust me. He'll want to
Your
watch it.
mailman would probably love it. So, the last section of this first episode of the podcast is talking about pop culture. And I love pop culture because it's simultaneously local, but it's also global. And there's different levels of it. So, we talked earlier about how stories change from region to region. And these are just word of mouth kind of things. But when you talk about pop culture, this is where it's stuff like movies, music, books, YouTube, for that matter, is now part of pop culture. So, Mike, I wanted to
Pretty
ask you
much.
a couple of questions because I think you're a little bit more tied into the pop culture side of this than I am. So,
I
I wanted to
thought
ask you a
so.
little bit about when it comes to like specifically ghosts and the paranormal, what are like the things that immediately come to mind to you as far as like pop culture and specifically movies, TV shows, and books? Like, what's out there?
Okay. So as far as ghosts, paranormal, supernatural, but in movies, dude, I would go automatically to for movies, the VHS series. If you like horror, if you're into the horror aspect of the supernatural, dude, the VHS series is phenomenal. The number,
Now, I, I want to double click into that because I want you to explain something to me.
okay,
And I realize that horror nowadays probably means a lot of other things, but let me give you a personal example and you tell me why this is the case.
okay,
So, when I think about paranormal horror type movies, I think about things like The Poltergeist, Children of the Corn, The Shining, and then eventually you get into Amityville and you get some more modern
yeah.
stuff. That's what I think about. The things I cannot stand are movies like Saw and those kind of
Ah,
things. And I feel like these are not
Ah,
the same be
no,
judged in the
no,
same, like,
no,
vein,
no.
but I feel like people just dump them into a bucket. So tell me, like, what is the
You
difference
just
there, and
did.
why what is it? Yeah, I did because I
So,
know there's
okay, let's rewind. So, horror is broken down and there's so just like any other movie, music, any media type genre where the creation of the end product is appreciated, the work and the minutia that goes into the details is appreciated. You have to be able to appreciate the and at the end of the day, it really comes down to the director, the writer, whomever created the story at the heart. You have to lend yourself to their vision.
yeah, if it's a BDT movie, then we're, like,
Exactly,
happy about it, right?
exactly. We love those. I don't know what that is, but yeah, we love that.
Benicio del Toro.
Oh, hell yeah. Dude, anything with did you ever see Grips?
Don't recall it at all, but
That
maybe.
was an intense movie, man. Kinda indie, but very him and Helen Hunt. But yeah, it was a good one. I digress. We were talking going back, what were we talking about? You can't do this to me, man. This to be
You were talking about breaking it into the
oh,
subgenres.
subgenres of horror movies, okay, because then you have your gore, you have your suspense, you have your psychological, you have your just in your face jump scare type thing. You have your Rob Zombie and you have your Eli Roth. These are 2 completely different mindsets.
I was just about to say House of a Thousand Corpses, and what was the other one?
Hostel, dude. Hostel was his creme de la creme, the
Yeah,
first one, dude. That movie
yeah,
was
but
oh my god.
there was 2 of them he did with the Firefly family. It was House of a Thousand Devil's
Oh,
Rejects, that was
no,
the other one.
yeah, I thought you were still
Yeah.
talking about, Eli Roth, sorry.
So, how do these lay out? What's the difference? Obviously, there's a difference there, but, like, how did these things get into their own little genres, and what's the key difference there?
It's the natural development of film from where it started to now. It's just it went from horror that was just like the Bela Lugosi, the Lon Chaney Jr., old school werewolf, and the Abbott and Costello meet the
Vampire, yeah.
mummy or meet the vampires or meets Dracula. Those were the old school horror movies that started everything. But then and it that back then it was such a new media. It was just this blanket horror. But even though it was funny and sometimes even though it scared the crap out of you and sometimes, at the end of the day, it was all horror. Now it's just there's so with the advent of or the availability of CG graphics and photography and just that and the I think the base imagination of people has just they're always trying to push the envelope, always trying to make
Yeah,
people
that's true.
stay
I
in.
I think
Yeah,
I think today about all the stuff you and I do with AI, right? Outside of this podcast with other stuff we work on. And I
right,
think about how far AI has come. Matter of fact, this episode's going to be edited not entirely by AI, but a good chunk of it's going to
probably.
be done by AI. And I think about it, and I'm like, for potential filmmakers, like I'm saying, like you're in college, right? Filmmaking is your thing.
Yeah,
With an iPhone or a Pixel Pro 9, whatever that thing is now,
yeah.
it's coming very soon. You're going to be able to create better than Hollywood has created for the
I was
last
gonna
100
say you
years.
can pretty much do that now. I mean,
Almost there.
I
Yeah.
it's pretty much there, man. If you're shooting your own footage, then that means that you have access to the camera. All you need to do is little filters, and it's in and that's another thing about horror versus like rom coms or just in general adventure movies or action movies. Horror is an emotional response. So it comes from somewhere inside. It's a reaction to something. So it's your own perception, your own how your brain is wired and how your brain reacts to things is how you perceive this movie. So as a from a movie maker's perspective, their job is to number one, make the movie palatable for the masses, but at the same time, keep their vision and keep it scary. Now, some people might love jump scares. Maybe that's the one thing that
Yeah. Maybe that's their thing.
their
Yeah.
thing. Yeah, exactly.
I just want to feel something.
Exactly. And that's what all movies should do. That should be
Yeah.
the
For
goal.
me, and granted, if you're a fan of that, awesome. And there's plenty of movies for you. But I will say to me, and mind you, I've watched a lot of horror movies over the years, and if I had to pick one scene where I think like the director, the writers, the cinematographer, everybody nailed it was in the original Paranormal Activity movie. I was in the theater. I watched it. I remember distinctly.
Did I go with
I
you? You
remember
weren't I wasn't with you, right?
no, you weren't with me,
Did we meet
but
up afterwards?
I either afterwards or
The
like
next
short
day,
like the
right?
next day or something. But I remember I was in there and that scene comes where they're putting the I think it's baby powder or something all over
On the
the place,
floor, yeah.
just on the floor because they're like trying to figure this thing out.
The dude's
And
coming from
then
the attic or whatever,
all of a
yeah.
sudden you hear not a jump scare, you hear a bass note,
Boom.
like boom, and then there's a chicken foot on the ground. People started screaming in that theater. I saw at least 10, 12 grown adults run, get out of their seats and run out of that theater
Dude,
screaming. And I
yes.
was like, "This right here is what it's all about." Like, you have nailed it
It
as
was
a
a good movie.
director as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, it's funny because I remember I went with I was double date. I was me and my date, and then my guy friend and his date, and he couldn't make it through the first 5 minutes of the movie because he had a pacemaker, and he was literally worried that he was gonna have heart issues. So he stayed in the lobby while me and the 2 girls watched the rest of the movie, like, with no problem. But I will tell you, that is the first time that I left a theater and I literally felt like a part of my soul died.
It
It
was
was
rough, that
that
movie.
bad. Yes.
Same thing. I walked out and I was just like, "What did I just watch?" And I saw,
Yeah.
again, grown adults not walk, run out of
Uh,
that theater. I had never seen that in my life before,
what's
and I
funny
have not seen it since then.
what's funny is that a lot of people actually compared people's reactions to that movie to the Blair Witch Project when Blair Witch Project first came out. And people
Yeah,
saw that and they actually thought it was a legitimate, real life found footage movie. This was like unheard of. Yeah, no.
yeah. I think you're right. I think that's where it's these things start to move into the pop culture psyche, and then they as far as, like, our history, those are in the past, and, again, I've seen many other ones since then, Insidious, and even
This
when
is
they came
great.
from even when they came from other cultures like Ring or The Ring, whatever it
Right,
was,
Ringu.
right? These were all great films and all this kinda stuff.
Another one that actually I would say made me feel like a part of my soul died. The first Insidious and
Mhm.
the first I can never remember the name of it. It was the one with Josh Hartnett, I think. He's a writer. He's studying these murders that happen where entire families are being wiped out, and there's these films being left over, and the kids end up finding the film of the previous house, and I don't know if it's Josh Hartnett. It's either Josh Hartnett or Ethan Hawke.
Yes.
Sinister.
And there's all kinds of new ideas coming out and new stuff. And as you pointed out a while back, like it's constantly evolving. There's new stuff coming all the time.
Oh yeah.
And
There's a new movie called Trap. Have you heard about that one?
no.
Okay, so I believe if I'm not mistaken, I believe that's M. Night Shyamalan movie, but
Mm,
it's entire concert that's being held at a city, but the entire thing is done under the guise of trying to hunt down a serial killer that might be there with his daughter. And the whole time it's Josh Hartnett and he's like there with his daughter and they some vendor tells him, "Oh man, like you think this is crazy? The whole thing is a secret. Don't tell anybody, but they're trying to hunt down this one killer guy, blah 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 blah." He's, "Oh, really?" And so it's he knows now that they're looking for him, and so the thing is that he now needs to go through the concert with his daughter, so it doesn't look like he's guilty, but also try to escape without the police finding him. So it's like this psychological suspense thriller
yeah,
thing that
suspense type of
dude is
thriller. And I think there's a lot of bleed over between those genres too. But yeah, we'll talk about a bunch of these and there'll probably be some impromptu movie reviews as we run through some of these
oh
episodes
yeah,
just because we run into all kinds of random
and I
stuff that,
watch
out
movies
there
all the time.
every day. If you want to talk about real horror, look what Michael Bay did to the Transformers and the Ninja Turtles. That's a whole nother
Don't
level of
start,
horror.
start.
But anyway, I think we've given a pretty good view, if you want to call it that, to our viewers and listeners as to where this is going. Now, this is obviously a very loose episode, if you want to put it that way, just because we're trying to cover a bunch of things. But I think in future episodes, there will be some where we just dial into one topic, right? And just go and talk about it, have a discussion, and just delve as deep as we
I
can
think that might be
into
a
it.
yeah, that's
So now I think it's time to put this one to a close. And doing that, I just wanted to remind all of our listeners and viewers, you're now at the end of the episode. You've got a pretty good idea of who Mike and I are and what this podcast is going to be about. If you're interested in that kind of stuff, definitely like the video, give us a subscribe, and share it with everyone who might like this type of stuff. Also, don't
guaranteed.
forget to check out the description below. Check out the links we put in there. The show notes will be both in the description and on the website as we publish it. Aside from that, Mike, are there any parting thoughts you want to give to our wonderful viewers and listeners?
Thanks, guys, for viewing our craziness. If you like, you said, if you like what you liked, let us know. Leave a comment or something, and give us some ideas because eventually I'm gonna run out of stuff to talk about.
I highly doubt that's going to happen, but it was a good sentiment.
Yes.
Yeah. And I just want to close with one thing for this episode, at least, which is Mike and I are going to be at the Portland Retro Gaming Expo here in a couple of weeks. That will bring this thing to a wrap, and we'll catch you all in the next episode.
I guess.